6 months ago, I sat at my desk on day 30 and thought seriously about reinstalling Windows. I had the ISO downloaded. I had the USB drive sitting in my bag. I had made peace with the idea that the experiment was over and that 30 days of terminal commands and sticky notes and borrowed printers had taught me what it needed to teach me. I was going to put Windows back, go back to the automatic network connections and the working VPN and the printers that found themselves, and I was going to learn Linux properly on a home machine where the only person affected by the learning curve was me. That was the plan. Sensible. Practical. Exactly what I would have recommended to anyone else in my situation. Then I did something that changed everything. I opened Windows 11 on another machine and just to remind myself what I was going back to, and I watched it spend 4 minutes installing updates before I could do anything. And something in me just could not do it. Not that day. I told myself I would give it one more week. 1 week became 2, 2 became a month became 3. And here I am, 6 months after the 30 days ended, still on Ubuntu, still in the same office with the same Windows-based infrastructure around me, writing this script on the same machine that ran that macro experiment. And what I want to tell you is, not that Linux suddenly became easy. It did not. What I want to tell you is what actually changed, and why staying was the right decision. Not for everyone, but for me in ways I did not fully understand when I started. To understand why I stayed, you need to understand what day 31 felt like, because it was different from any of the 30 days before it in one specific way. On day 31, I woke up, opened my laptop, and I did not have to think about what to do first. The network drive command was in my fingers. The VPN sequence was automatic. Opening Teams in the browser and pinning the tab was a habit I had stopped registering as a step. The morning setup that had taken me 45 confused minutes on day 1 now took about 90 seconds. That is the thing about friction that nobody tells you at the beginning. Friction decreases. Not completely. Not on every front. But the friction that comes from unfamiliarity, from not knowing where the thing is or how the command goes or which format the server address wants, that friction drops substantially once you have done it enough times that your hands know what to do before your brain catches up. What remained after day 30 were the real structural problems. And the ones that existed not because I was new to Ubuntu, but because Ubuntu and the Windows Office environment have genuine incompatibilities that do not go away with practice. And I had to make a decision about those, but I also had something on day 31 that I had not had on day 1. I had context, I knew exactly which problems were mine to carry, and I had a much clearer sense of whether I could carry them. Let me tell you about the setup I built over the first 3 months, because this is actually the most practically useful part of this video. The thing that makes Linux sustainable in a Windows-heavy environment is not tolerance. It is architecture. You build a setup that routes around the structural incompatibilities, rather than fighting them daily. The first thing I did was stop trying to make every single tool work natively on Ubuntu, and identify which tools genuinely needed to run natively and which ones could live in the browser without meaningful cost. Email in Outlook Web. No practical difference from the native app for the specific tasks I use email for. Google Docs for most of my writing. Actually, better than Word for collaborative work because it lives in the browser and renders identically for everyone. Calendar through this browser? Fine. Teams through the browser? Still imperfect. But I fixed the notification problem in month 2 with a browser extension that pulls Teams notifications into the System Notification Center. Not the same as the native app, but close enough that I have not missed a single meeting since I set it up. The things that genuinely needed to stay native were few but important. The VPN, the file server access, printing, and the occasional Windows-only tool that I handled through a different method entirely, which I will get to shortly. The printer situation, which on day 1 had cost me an hour of configuration for something Windows did in 90 seconds, took me about 3 weeks in month 2 to fully resolve. Not because Ubuntu suddenly got better at printers, because I learned the CUPS interface properly. I spent one Saturday afternoon, not during work hours, going through every printer in the Office network one by one, installing the correct PPD driver files from the manufacturer's repository, configuring each printer profile, and saving the settings. After that Saturday, printing from Ubuntu was not as seamless as it was on Windows. I want to be honest about that. It still requires that I select the correct printer profile manually rather than it detecting automatically. But it worked. Reliably. Every time. For all 3 Office printers. The hour I lost on day 1 trying to print one document became a fixed one-time cost of one Saturday afternoon, and after that, it stopped being a problem. That pattern, the large upfront investment that eliminates a recurring daily problem, turned out to be true for almost every structural issue I had encountered in the first 30 days. The cost was real. It was just mostly a setup cost, not an ongoing one. Month 2 is also when I solved the Excel macro problem in a way that I think is actually more interesting than just reinstalling Windows. What I set up was a virtual machine, a contained Windows 11 environment running inside Ubuntu using a tool called VirtualBox. The virtual machine takes about 90 seconds to start up. It runs Windows 11 properly with Excel, with all the VBA macros functioning exactly as they do on a native Windows machine. It sits in a window on my Ubuntu desktop. When a .xsm file comes in that has complex macros, which happens maybe 2 or 3 times a week, I open the virtual machine, process the file in Excel, save it, close the virtual machine, continue working in Ubuntu. The total overhead per macro file is about 4 minutes, including startup time. 4 minutes is not nothing. But 4 minutes once or twice a week is vastly less disruptive than either carrying Windows as my primary system or spending hours trying to coax VBA into running in LibreOffice. The virtual machine became my pressure valve, the thing that turned an absolute hard blocker into a manageable exception. And once that was in place, the last genuinely serious argument for going back to Windows as my primary system went away. The VPN improved in month 3, not because the IT infrastructure changed, but because I took the time to write a proper shell script, a small automated program, that handles the entire VPN connection sequence with a single command. I named it something I will not repeat here because it is genuinely not printable. But every morning I open the terminal, type that one word, and the VPN connects. It confirms the connection and closes the terminal window. What had been a multi-step sequence I had to think about every morning became a single keyboard command that I do not have to consciously remember. This is something that Linux allows you to do that Windows fundamentally does not. On Windows, automating your own workflows requires either third-party software or learning PowerShell at a reasonably serious level. On Ubuntu, writing a shell script that automates a repetitive task is something you can learn to do in an afternoon. The ability to script your own environment to build the exact automation you need for your specific situation turned out to be one of the most practical advantages of Linux in daily professional use. Not because the tools are shinier, because you can reach into the system and change how things work in ways Windows simply does not allow. I also want to talk about what month 4 brought, which was a performance comparison I had not expected to be as dramatic as it was. By month 4, I had been using Ubuntu on the same hardware for roughly 7 months total. The laptop was 4 years old. Mid-range hardware when it was bought, nothing special. On Windows 10, by year 3 of its life, this machine was slow in the specific way that aging Windows machines get slow, not broken, not crashing, just accumulating the kind of background drag that builds up over years of updates and installed software and registry changes and startup programs that nobody explicitly asked for. Boot time was around 4 minutes to a usable desktop. Opening a browser with a few tabs took 20 seconds before it was fully responsive. Running multiple applications simultaneously produced noticeable slowdowns. On Ubuntu, after 7 months, the same machine booted in 11 seconds. The browser opened in under 5. Running a video call, a document editor, the file manager, and a music player simultaneously produced no slowdown I could measure. The system never accumulated background drag because Linux does not accumulate it the same way. There is no registry degrading over time. There are no startup services added by software installations without your knowledge. What is running on your machine is what you put there. That is it. After 7 months on the same hardware, the performance gap between my Ubuntu machine and comparable Windows machines in the office had grown, not shrunk. Not because Ubuntu got faster, because Windows over time gets heavier. Now, let us talk about the thing that I genuinely did not predict when I started this. The way using Linux for 6 months changed how I understand computers. I'm not a developer. I did not come into this with a technical background. I was a regular office worker who used Windows the way most people use Windows, as a surface you click on without thinking about what is underneath it. 6 months of Ubuntu changed that relationship completely. Not because I became a system administrator, because Linux does not hide the system from you the way Windows does. When something goes wrong on Windows, you get an error code and a suggestion to restart. When something goes wrong on Ubuntu, you get an actual message explaining what failed, where it failed, and often what to try. When you install software on Ubuntu through the package manager, you see what is being installed and what it depends on. When your system starts up, you can see every service that is running and why it is running. The system is transparent in a way that Windows is deliberately not. And over 6 months, that transparency built a kind of understanding that I now find genuinely useful in my daily work. I diagnose problems faster. I understand why things work the way they do. I'm less dependent on IT support for issues I can now read and solve myself. That is not a small thing. That is a skill. And it transferred. The mental model I built from 6 months of Ubuntu made me measurably better at working with technology in general, including the Windows machines I still touch regularly. The file compatibility situation also settled into something manageable that I want to describe accurately. LibreOffice and Microsoft Office are not fully compatible. I want to say that plainly because I have read articles that overstate how good the compatibility is, and I think that overstating it does a disservice to people who are trying to make a realistic decision. For regular documents with standard formatting, paragraphs, headings, tables, normal fonts, the compatibility is genuinely good. Files go back and forth without visible issues in the majority of cases. For complex formatting involving text boxes, custom styles, advanced section breaks, or embedded objects, there are real differences that will sometimes show up when a file is opened on the other system. I handle this in month 6 the same way I handled it in month 2. Documents I create that are going to be viewed by clients or presented formally, I open in the virtual machine and verify how they look in Word before sending. It takes 30 seconds. Not ideal, but reliable. For the 80% of documents I create and share internally with colleagues who open them on their own screens and are looking at content rather than pixel-perfect formatting, LibreOffice is completely adequate. The remaining 20% are handled with a 30-second verification step. That is the actual situation after 6 months of real daily use. Before I get to month 5, I want to talk about something that happened around month 3 that I did not expect to matter as much as it did. I started noticing other people, not in a dramatic way, just in the way you notice things when you're paying attention to something you did not use to pay attention to. In that office of roughly 80 people, I was the only person running Linux. There were maybe 6 people running Macs, which the IT team supported officially. Everyone else was on Windows. And over 3 months, I had developed a way of seeing the Windows machines around me that I had never had before, because I had never had a reason to look carefully. I started noticing specifically the things Windows was doing that the people using it had completely stopped seeing. The notification in the bottom corner asking to set up a OneDrive backup. The browser that opened to the Microsoft Start page instead of the page the person had set as their home page, because an update had reset it. The machine that sat on a desk playing a Windows Update progress screen at 9:45 in the morning, while the person who owned it was standing in the kitchen waiting to start their day. The Teams app that launched at startup whether you wanted it or not. The pop-up asking whether you would like to try Microsoft Edge. The second pop-up asking again the following week. None of these are catastrophic. Individually, they are trivial. But I had spent 3 months on a machine where none of that happened, where nothing ran unless I put it there, where no pop-up appeared that I had not caused. And looking at the Windows machines through that lens made me notice how much quiet background noise the average Windows user accepts as just the way computers work. It is not the way computers have to work. It is the way Windows specifically works. That realization, feeling it rather than just knowing it intellectually, made going back feel impossible in a way that surprised me. Month 3 also brought something else I want to give proper space to. The Linux community. I do not mean this in a vague, warm way. I mean it specifically and practically. When you use Windows and something breaks, your options are to search for a Microsoft support article, open a ticket with your IT team, or search for a forum post and hope. Someone had your exact problem in 2019. The quality of the help you get is highly variable, and the forum posts are frequently outdated. When you use Ubuntu and something breaks, you have access to the Ubuntu forums. Ask Ubuntu, and a population of users and contributors who answer questions with a specificity and depth that I found genuinely remarkable. In 3 months, I posted 6 questions to Ask Ubuntu. All 6 received substantive correct answers within hours. One of them, about a specific audio driver issue that I genuinely did not expect anyone to know about, received 3 different answers within 90 minutes, all from different people, 2 of whom linked to the exact commit in the Ubuntu kernel that had introduced the issue and the exact version that had fixed it. That level of specificity, that depth of available knowledge from people who contribute it freely and without obligation, changed how I thought about being stuck on a technical problem. On Windows, being stuck meant waiting for someone else to help you. On Ubuntu, being stuck meant starting a conversation with people who genuinely wanted the problem solved. The experience of asking for help is different in a way that matters over 6 months of daily use. By month 4, I had also stopped thinking of the virtual machine as a workaround and started thinking of it as a feature. Having a contained Windows 11 environment that I could spin up for specific tasks and shut down when I was done was, if I was honest about it, a more controlled and secure way of running Windows-dependent software than running Windows as my primary system. The Windows virtual machine could not reach my Ubuntu files without me explicitly sharing them. It could not install software that would affect my main system. When I was done with the macro, I shut it down and it was gone. Completely, nothing it had done persisted in my environment. No registry change, no background service, no startup entry. For the specific category of work I used it for, this turned out to be the right tool used correctly. Not a compromise, an architecture decision that happened to be better than the obvious alternative. There is something I noticed around month 5 that I think is worth naming clearly because it surprised me. I stopped resenting the differences. That sounds small. It is not. In the first 30 days, every point of friction carried a specific emotional charge. Every time the network drive failed to connect automatically, or the printer needed a manual selection, or the Teams tab did not show me a notification, I felt a version of, why is this harder than it needs to be? That feeling was exhausting on top of the practical difficulty. By month 5, that feeling was mostly gone, not because the friction was gone. Some of it remains and will remain as long as I'm working in a Windows office with Ubuntu hardware. But I had stopped comparing my experience to what Windows would have provided and started accepting Ubuntu as its own environment with its own logic and its own trade-offs. That shift from why is this not like Windows to this is how this works is something that happens with any skill you develop over time, and it is not specific to Linux. But in the Linux context, it matters enormously because a lot of the unhappiness people experience when switching comes not from the technical reality of what Linux cannot do, but from the psychological comparison to what they already knew. Stop comparing. Start learning the system on its own terms. The experience changes substantially when you do that. I also want to be direct about what did not get better in 6 months, because if I only tell you the good parts, this becomes the kind of video I do not trust when I watch it. The corporate IT compliance situation did not change. My machine remained technically non-compliant on the company network for the entire 6 months, and the informal agreement with the IT team that kept me operational remained an informal agreement, which means it rested entirely on the goodwill of specific people and could have changed if those people had changed or if a compliance audit had required a stricter approach. If you are considering this in your own workplace, that is a real risk that you need to honestly assess. The timesheet portal still does not work in my Ubuntu browsers. I still submit from a colleague's machine twice a week. 6 months in, that is just a thing I do. It takes 90 seconds, and I have stopped finding it annoying. But if you ask me whether it is a solved problem, the honest answer is no. The Teams browser experience is better than it was in month 1, but it is still not the native app experience. The notification extension helps. Background blur on calls still does not work in the browser version. For a video call where you are presenting to external clients, this is relevant. For internal calls with colleagues who have seen your real background for 6 months, it has stopped mattering. Let me tell you about the one moment in these 6 months that came closest to making me actually reinstall Windows, because I think it is important to be honest about it. It was month 4. I had a new project that required regular collaboration with an external agency that used a specific project management tool. A tool I had not used before. A tool that turned out to be built as a Windows desktop application with a browser interface that was explicitly marked in the documentation as limited functionality. When I went to the browser version, roughly 40% of the features were grayed out and marked Windows app only. I contacted the agency and explained my situation. They were professional and accommodating. They sent me exports of the data I needed for my parts of the project. We found a workflow. But for 3 weeks, the collaboration was slower and more manual than it needed to be, and I was aware that I was asking more of my external partners than I should have needed to. The agency lead said something to me at the end of that project that was not unkind but was clear. He said, "You might want to think about whether the personal preference is worth the professional overhead." He was not wrong. I thought about it seriously. I made the same calculation I had been making since month 1. The overhead was real but contained. The benefits I was getting from staying on Ubuntu were real and growing. I stayed. Oh, what are those benefits, specifically, after 6 months? Let me give you them plainly. Performance. On aging hardware that would have forced a Windows machine into replacement is the clearest and most financially concrete one. The security model on Linux, where you're not running as an administrator by default, and where system changes require explicit permission, means I have had 0 malware incidents in 6 months on a machine that had 3 in its last 2 years on Windows, 2 of which required IT involvement to clean. Battery life is genuinely, measurably better. Roughly 25 to 30% more runtime on the same hardware doing the same tasks. Boot time of 11 seconds. Compared to the 4 minutes I had on this machine running Windows. The development skills and system literacy I have built, which have made me more capable in my work and less dependent on other people to solve technical problems. The privacy reality of not having my usage data collected and transmitted by my operating system. And the cost, which is 0, as it has been from day 1. One thing I did not anticipate when I stayed on Ubuntu was discovering how much software I had been missing by living inside the Microsoft ecosystem. Not because Microsoft software is bad, it is not, but because when you're inside a closed ecosystem, you tend to use kept me operational remained an informal agreement, which means it rested entirely on the goodwill of specific people, and could have changed if those people had changed, or if a compliance audit had required a stricter approach. If you are considering this in your own workplace, that is a real risk that you need to honestly assess. The timesheet portal still does not work in my Ubuntu browsers. I still submit from a colleague's machine twice a week. 6 months in, that is just a thing I do. It takes 90 seconds, and I have stopped finding it annoying. But if you ask me whether it is a solved problem, the honest answer is no. The Teams browser experience is better than it was in month 1, but it is still not the native app experience. The notification extension helps. Background blur on calls still does not work in the browser version. For a video call where you are presenting to external clients, this is relevant. For internal calls with colleagues who have seen your real background for 6 months, it has stopped mattering. Let me tell you about the one moment in these 6 months that came closest to making me actually reinstall Windows, because I think it is important to be honest about it. It was month 4. I had a new project that required regular collaboration with an external agency that used a specific project management tool. A tool I had not used before. A tool that turned out to be built as a Windows desktop application with a browser interface that was explicitly marked in the documentation as limited functionality. When I went to the browser version, roughly 40% of the features were grayed out and marked Windows app only. I contacted the agency and explained my situation. They were professional and accommodating. They sent me exports of the data I needed for my parts of the project. We found a workflow. But for 3 weeks, the collaboration was slower and more manual than it needed to be. And I was aware that I was asking more of my external partners than I should have needed to. The agency lead said something to me at the end of that project that was not unkind, but was clear. He said, "You might want to think about whether the personal preference is worth the professional overhead." He was not wrong. I thought about it seriously. I made the same calculation I had been making since month 1. The overhead was real, but contained. The benefits I was getting from staying on Ubuntu were real and growing. I stayed. What are those benefits, specifically, after 6 months? Let me give you them plainly. Performance on aging hardware that would have forced a Windows machine into replacement is the clearest and most financially concrete one. The security model on Linux, where you're not running as an administrator by default and where system changes require explicit permission, means I have had 0 malware incidents in 6 months on a machine that had 3 in its last 2 years on Windows, 2 of which required IT involvement to clean. Battery life is genuinely, measurably better. Roughly 25 to 30% more runtime on the same hardware doing the same tasks. Boot time of 11 seconds compared to the 4 minutes I had on this machine running Windows. The development skills and system literacy I have built, which have made me more capable in my work and less dependent on other people to solve technical problems. The privacy reality of not having my usage data collected and transmitted by my operating system. And the cost, which is 0 as it has been from day 1. One thing I did not anticipate when I stayed on Ubuntu was discovering how much software I had been missing by living inside the Microsoft ecosystem. Not because Microsoft software is bad, it is not, but because when you're inside a closed ecosystem, you tend to use whatever that ecosystem offers rather than finding the best tool for the specific job. On Ubuntu, I had no ecosystem pulling me toward one set of tools over another. Everything was a choice, so I made choices based on what actually worked best for each task. Processing and PDF manipulation that did in 2 commands, what used to require a web service and an upload. None of these are Linux exclusive discoveries. Most of them are cross-platform, but I would not have gone looking for them if I had stayed in the Windows environment where the built-in options are always right there and always just sufficient enough that you stop wondering if there is something better. Ubuntu removed the floor that Microsoft had put under my software decisions. And what I found when that floor was gone was that better tools existed for almost every part of my daily work. Not exotic, not technical, just better. And choosing them had built a working environment that was actually designed around how I work, rather than around what Microsoft decided I should want. In 6 months, I have also watched what happened to the Windows 11 machines around me in the office. Several colleagues received mandatory upgrades from Windows 10 to Windows 11 during this period. The process was, in most cases, smooth. But Windows 11 brought with it a new set of interface changes that required relearning workflows that had been established and comfortable. The new Start menu layout confused people. The taskbar changes took time to adapt to. Several tools had compatibility issues with Windows 11 that required IT to intervene. One colleague's printer configuration broke entirely during the upgrade and took 3 days to resolve, which is, if you are keeping track, longer than it took me to configure my printers from scratch on Ubuntu in month 2. I am not saying Windows 11 is bad. I am saying that no operating system change is frictionless, and the perception that staying on Windows means staying on familiar stable ground is not always accurate. Windows updates change things. Windows upgrades change more things. The friction you accept when you choose Windows is less visible than the friction you accept when you choose Linux, but it is not 0. Here's where I have landed after 6 months. And I want to give you this as a genuine assessment rather than a conclusion I decided on before I started writing. Linux in 2026, specifically Ubuntu, is a viable daily operating system for office work. Not for every office worker, not without setup costs and ongoing trade-offs, but viable in a way that means you can do your full professional job on it without significant loss of capability if you are willing to invest time in building the right setup, if your workplace will tolerate a non-standard device on the network, and if you are the kind of person who finds the process of understanding your tools to be worthwhile in itself, rather than purely a cost. I am that person. The 30 days that I thought had ended the experiment turned out to be the education that made the following 6 months possible. Every problem in those 30 days was pointing at something I needed to learn. The VPN issue taught me how VPN clients work. The printer problem taught me the CUPS system. The macro failure pointed me toward virtual machines. The Outlook friction pushed me toward building better browser-based workflows. The 30 days were not the experiment. They were the prerequisite. The experiment is the 6 months after, and 6 months after, I am still here. Still on Ubuntu, still in the same Windows-heavy office, still using the sticky note terminal commands, though now there are fewer of them because I have automated most of the rest, still occasionally jealous of how automatically everything connects for the Windows machines around me. I'm still completely certain that this is the right machine for the way I work. There's one more thing I want to say before the conclusion, and it is for the specific person who watched the first video, recognized their own situation in it, and is now asking the same question I was asking at the end of day 30. Should I stay or should I go back? Here's what I wish someone had told me on day 30. The question is not really about Linux. Linux is just the context. The actual question is what kind of relationship you want to have with the tools you use every day. If you want tools that work without requiring your understanding, tools you interact with at the surface and never think about underneath, Windows is the better answer, and there's no shame in that. Most professional environments are built on that model, and it functions. But if you are the kind of person who finds it satisfying to understand the things you use, who would rather spend a Saturday afternoon learning a system properly than live with a process that slightly annoys you every day, who gets genuine pleasure from the moment a thing you built yourself starts working the way you intended, then staying on Linux past the hard part will give you something that Windows never can. Not because Windows is bad, because understanding is not essence. Smething Windows is designed to give you. It is designed to give you results while keeping the mechanism invisible. Linux gives you the mechanism. What you do with it is up to you. I'm not going back to Windows 11, not because Windows 11 is bad software, not because this was easy or because Linux won some kind of argument, because after 6 months of building something, of learning a system from the inside, rather than just using a surface, of having a computer that runs exactly the processes I put on it and nothing else, of genuinely understanding why things work the way they work. After all of that, opening a Windows machine now feels like being handed a car where the hood is welded shut. You can drive it. It will take you where you are going. But if you have spent 6 months understanding what is under the hood, being told that you're not supposed to need to know feels like a loss. Linux gave me back the inside of my own computer. That is not a small thing. After 6 months of it, it turns out it was the reason I stayed all along. Even on the days I was printing the same document 3 times.